Hey kids, this is Ivan. How you doing? As I mentioned very recently, sometimes what happens is that I don't catch the fact that a comment has been held, for review or is likely spam, because normally I use my phone or I use like my iPad, and I'm not using applications that have the functionality of the actual YouTube website. So there were a few comments that were held, and I just had no idea they were there. So I checked recently, and one of them was on this video right here. It's like Lamentations of the Flame Princess and OSR, the game experience. It was the final video I made in a series which started out as an answer to Lee, Your Humble Game Master, like a couple of years ago at least, talking about what are these games actually like, and I kind of went down this rabbit hole of talking about these games. But there was this really good question asked 7 months ago now, I feel really bad, by Randal Glyph, and it got held as potential spam, and I just had no idea it was there. So I saw it a few days ago. I even mentioned it and talked about part of it with a group of my friends, like a private group, the group of us that play together. So this is a really interesting question that he's asked here. It's a long comment, so I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I wanted to address it because essentially what Randall starts talking about is the lethality of Lamentations of the Flame Princess, and the fact that lots of people like the lethality. They say this is a selling point of it. And some people say, and I've heard this myself, in fact I think I have a few videos talking about this a little bit, the idea that characters just don't live long enough to progress to high levels, and that should just be considered part of the vibe of the game experience and its own thing. And he asks, does this match my own experience? And does having player characters trapped at lower levels and continuously losing connections to each other as they die off strike me as a stunted gaming experience? At least as far as my go-to system of choice. And as time is going on, I don't know this is necessarily my go-to system of choice, because there are other systems that I'm really, really digging these days, but it's one of them. It's something that I'm rather comfortable with. And he goes on to say that he likes the rules-like games, with no guarantee of successfully beating the opposition, and danger within manageable limits, but an endless round of dead PCs strikes him as really lacking in full developments. Risk, yes. Near certainty of death, no. And goes on, normal OSR doesn't, let's see, blah, blah, blah. Weird hard limitations might need constant death, but I think that's a marketed niche ploy rather than a sincere motivation. And here's where he says something really interesting. Gygax's and Arneson's players all had their initial characters reach high levels. They had no player skill. No one did. It hadn't been invented yet. I really like that. And the first time these traps and ambushes were used, player characters and whole parties should have been getting permanently ground up. Somebody was fudging die rolls, and things were not actually that lethal in their own home games, as a revisionist mantra of hardcore gaming would have us believe. Or Raise Dead or Wish spells were very available to make sure that death was not a permanent phenomenon. So he asks at the end of all this, do you character longevity might be an issue to discuss my reactions to. Is it actually old school, or is it revisionist? Is it viable for any long-term play? If so, how? 3 minutes have gone by and I still haven't started to answer the question, but I thought this is a really, really good question and something worthy of examining. And it brings up the really interesting points, one of those 500-pound gorillas in the room, if you will. Do you think some of these people back in the day fudge die rolls? That they kind of, soften the blows in order to have the story move forward, or to keep these characters that they'd started to like, alive, all that sort of stuff. My off-the-cuff feeling is yes, probably they did. This is probably part of the original game experience as they were playing this and trying to figure, well, how does this all work? And what is our real intention for play? Things like actual intentions for play wouldn't show up in terms of being incredibly thought out and discussed until a long time later. And I've talked at length about some of the various theories that have come out. And as my friend Brian had just talked about in another group, there's lots of dissertations that have been written on role-playing games and all that sort of stuff. I don't want to go down that road, but just, things have changed. People have started to think about this a little bit more often. But, it's clear that back in the day, some of that was happening. And not only was it happening at the tables of the people that created the original Dungeons and Dragons and all that sort of stuff, but it certainly was happening at other tables too, including some of the tables that I sat at. We fudged die rolls. We, came upon situations where all of a sudden it was going, to end up in a TPK, or things that were going to happen that as a game master, maybe one of us decided, I don't want that to happen because that's going to be unfortunate. I like these characters. Maybe I have a story. Maybe there's something they're supposed to go do. And so As a result, we didn't engage the system. We didn't let the plastic god speak, or we decide not to roll dice. Whatever actually happened, in some way we sort of fudge things to let things move on. And people do this to this very day, and I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but that's part of, play the right game. And, what's your actual intention for playing? And, are you playing the right game? All that sort of stuff. But as so far as the lethality element in something like Lamentations of the Flame Princess, my own experience has been that it's not any more lethal than the original games we used to play, which could be pretty lethal. I think what it boils down to is, you look at the modules that come out, and there's a certain shtick that goes along with those. They are supposed to be a little over the top. I actually enjoy the modules written by James Raggi himself more than some of the other ones. That's just personal preference, really has nothing to do with anything. But there are some parts in there where you can take one wrong step and it's very, very bad. It's supposed to be rather horrific. That's part of the weird horror vibe. But overall, if you look at the rule set, if you look at how the game actually operates, when you start to create your own game world, how am I going to run this? Not necessarily how am I going to run this, but what's the world actually going to be like? What's actually going to be in it? My own experience has been it's not super lethal. However, the chance of a character death happening, it's not off the table. One of the things that I encountered, back in the day, not so long ago really, so not so much back in the day, back in the week, whatever it is. When I came back and I started playing like games like Pathfinder, what I found was that, and nothing's wrong with that game, but what I found was that, my goodness, it's a lot harder to die. It seemed like our choices mattered less, and when you were involved in some really big slog, there were all these various safety nets. And I looked at other games, other versions of Dungeons and Dragons, and then some other games. I saw a whole bunch of safety nets in place where character death was almost completely off the table, or you would take quite a few circumstances in order for the character to finally die. At the time, this really rubbed me the wrong way. Having the benefit of some hindsight and looking more at intentions for play, I understand now why certain games are developed that way. I understand why even something like Fantasy Flight Games Star Wars, it takes a while to actually kill the characters. They have to be knocked unconscious. It would have to take several actual critical hits to actually end the life of a character. But that's part of the vibe of that rather pulpy genre. I understand now why they do that. It's been my experience with not just Lamentations of the Flame Princess, but even something like Ubiquity. There is a certain level of lethality that is inherent in the game. And honestly, right now, playing something like D100, it's more possible to die in a matter of a couple bad die rolls. It doesn't mean that's going to happen all the time, but the possibility exists. We had that the character death in my Lamentations in Prussia game, where Jason's character died, and he died in a matter of 2 rounds. It wasn't, but we didn't experience a whole string of character deaths. It was just at that particular time there were some bad die rolls, and that's what happened. But he also put himself in a situation where it wasn't all that great. I've had my own character die in Lamentations years ago, and they died in 1 round, but they got up to 7th level before anything happened. They'd gotten injured a few times, and they were pretty close to death once or twice, but they managed to scrape by. But it wasn't this constant meat grinder of losing character after character after character. You can certainly play a game that way. That is not my preferred style of play. That does, for me, tend to ring kind of hollow. But I like a little bit more interaction with, fleshing these characters out and who they become. That doesn't mean that I want to fudge die rolls and cheat, to allow the characters to live. There was a time in my gaming career when I thought I felt personally it was more acceptable. Today, and this is just for me, I find that more dishonest. But I've also found that I don't necessarily have to be dishonest because the game isn't a constant meat grinder. That's just been my own personal experience. Even in Ubiquity, my character Philippe Moreau has come really close to dying a few times. And it's always when Francois Letard is the game master. It's usually me getting shot. All this last time, and my character still isn't out of the woods yet. He's, been attacked by all these little fleshy balls of God knows what, some kind of demon. Yeah. And once again, in a game like that, in a few bad die rolls, you can really end up in a lot of trouble. That doesn't mean it's a constant meat grinder. What it means is that our choices matter, that dangerous situations are in fact really dangerous, and that at any given moment, should the tide of battle turn a certain way, or whatever's actually happening, whatever the peril is in the world, that possibility is on the table because it's meant to simulate a different kind of genre. At the end of the day, Lamentations of the Flame Princess isn't meant to be pulp heroics. It's meant to be a little bit grittier. The mechanics themselves, in terms of character death, how that all works, how injury works, it supports more of a possibility of lethality, not constant lethality, and that's a very big difference. So I don't know if that answered the question, but I thought it was really kind of a provocative question, especially when you talk about the kind of revisionism that has happened in a lot of, as part of the war cry of something like old school, or this is a really gritty game, and, I resonate, or that resonated with me, the fact that, back in the day, it's highly probable that the creators didn't play the game that way, or, they cheated, they fudged some die rolls, and that we certainly did too. Coming back and now and saying that we always played it in this really highly lethal way is I'm speaking for myself. That's disingenuous. But at the end of the day, I don't believe that, or hasn't been my experience that Lamentations is this highly lethal, death around every corner sort of game. It's just that it's more possible in this game than it is in some others. But it's not the only game on the block where a swift death in the right circumstances is not rather forthcoming. In our Call of Cthulhu game, D100, it's just as likely. It has nothing to do necessarily with the mythos. It has to do with just how that game handles things like combat. We're using the Mithras system, and it's pretty dicey. No pun intended. So I thought that was a good question. Have a good one, kids.